Welcome, everyone, to this virtual conversation focused on the future of mental health, treatments, and neuroscience. This is the fifth in a series of mental health events that we are running focused on the science behind the mental health crisis in the United States. I'm Dr. Carrie Wolinetz. I'm the Deputy Director for Health and Life Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I'm very fortunate to be joined here today by two preeminent scientists. And I'll just say, in my job, I get to work with a lot of really amazing scientists. And these are among two of the most cool scientists that I've ever experienced. So I'm incredibly excited about the conversation today. And I hope that they're actually going to be able to peer into the future a little bit to tell us what kinds of advances are on the horizon that may revolutionize the way we understand and treat mental health and other brain conditions. So it'll be a really extraordinary conversation. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Nye. John is the director of the BRAIN Initiative. That's the Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies at the National Institutes of Health. This initiative was launched at the White House in 2013, and it's set forth the audacious goal of developing new tools that will revolutionize our understanding of the human brain. The BRAIN Initiative is led by John as its stalwart leader at NIH, but it actually represents the partnership of 5 federal agencies, along with a number of private foundations and organizations. John is also a senior investigator within the intramural research program at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, where his research focuses on understanding how brain cells develop and regenerate, particularly in the parts of the brain that control the sense of smell. So welcome, John. Next, we have Dr. Kafui Dzirasa. Kaf is the K. Rama Krishnan Endowed Associate Professor at Duke University with appointments in, wait for it, the departments of psychiatry, behavioral sciences, neurobiology, biomedical engineering, and neurosurgery. Got through the list. I just want to take a moment to highlight a few of his many accomplishments. He's the first African-American to complete a PhD in neurobiology at Duke University, alongside his medical training in psychiatry. He's the recipient of a Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers, and he's been involved with the BRAIN Initiative as well, both as a research grant recipient and as a member of the external group that was tasked with critically evaluating the initiative's progress and providing scientific guidance on new directions. And his research interests focus on understanding how changes in the brain produce neurological and mental illness. So really right on points for the topic that we're talking about today. So we're gathered for this conversation in support of President Biden's Unity Agenda and the goal of tackling the national mental health crisis. To that end, there's a huge focus within this administration on what we can do now to strengthen system capacity, as well as to connect Americans to mental health care, and also to create and support environments that promote mental health. We wholeheartedly support that focus on the current crisis and acknowledge that many in our audience today contribute to those goals too, either as practitioners or policy folks or researchers. And for that, we thank you for what you're doing and for joining us today. But we wanted to spend today's session thinking a little farther into the future about what's coming down the pipeline in science and technology, particularly in neuroscience, that could set the foundation for mental health treatments in the near or far future. A lot of this work has been driven by the BRAIN Initiative, which is nearing the 10-year anniversary of its unveiling at the White House in 2013, which is very exciting and sort of hard to believe, honestly, that it's been 10 years. So to that end, I want to thank both of our speakers for being here today, along with all of you who have tuned in either live or who are listening to this in the recorded session. Many of you have submitted questions in advance, for which we thank you. We're going to try to get to as many of these as possible in our conversation, but we probably won't be able to, given we've got limited time. But our plan with this, as with our other webinars, is to collect them at the end and try to answer as many of them in a blog post or other written communication. So without further ado, let's dive in if our panelists are ready. And John, I'm going to start with you first. So many neuroscientists out there are, of course, aware of the Brain Initiative, but I think it would be helpful, given that we have a lot of non-science members of our audience, to talk about what this work means for the average American. Why is it important for us to understand how the brain works and develop new technologies to help with that?
Thanks so much, Carrie. Thanks for having us here. I'm delighted to be here with my good friend and colleague, Kath. So it goes back to the acronym for brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies. The brain is the most complex organ in the body. It comprises 86 billion with a B neurons or nerve cells, about twice as many other cells that facilitate their function. And these cells are wired up in circuits, and they drive our behavior, responsible for our emotion, our know how it works. I mean, we scratch the surface, but we don't have the tools to really understand fully how it works, not just in health, but really in disease. And of the most vexing diseases that face us today are the ones that affect our emotions, our moods, mental health disorders. And these are the problems that we are desperate to solve. We need better tools for understanding how circuits work, what their components are, what's going wrong in different disorders, not just in mental health, but other degenerative disorders and so forth. So I think the popular analogy right now is consider the James Webb Telescope. It's allowing us to peer further and further out into the universe to understand what's out there. What we need are better tools to understand what's going on in here so we can help solve some of the most devastating afflictions that face us as a society and as families.
Great, thank you. Kath, I think I barely scratched the surface of the work that you do in my introduction. Can you give us a little insight into what your research team is working on and the kinds of questions you're trying to answer? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, always the Zoom challenges. It was such an honor and pleasure to be here. I am a Kath Drasa, and I'm an engineer, a psychiatrist, and a neuroscientist down at Duke University. And if there are any young people out there and your questions aren't answered, you can always shoot me a tweet at kathwudrasa.com or at kathwudrasa, and I'll be happy to answer it as the day goes along. So as John mentioned, the brain is filled with over 200 billion cells, and just about under half of those can create or process electricity. And so as an engineer, I'm really interested in how the electrical patterns of those cells come together to form what we call emotions: happiness, sadness, frustration, and anxiety. And then the idea is, if we can understand those patterns, we can get concrete, objective measures for emotional states, both when they're well, but also when folks have challenges with emotions, things like depression or autism or anxiety. And if we're able to do that, then ultimately we can figure out how to take these abnormal patterns and essentially come up with therapeutics that push them back into normal states. The analogy I always use is, if you think about getting chest pain and you go in the hospital, one of the things they do is they look at the electrical patterns, which is how all of the cells in your heart, which create electricity, come together to form a pattern of heart waves, right? Or electrical patterns in your heart, what we call an electrocardiogram. And then we figure out what the best treatment is for you. For some people, it's a medication that targets heart chemistry. For other people, it actually targets electricity, things like a pacemaker. And so we're working on both creating the ways of measuring and understanding those patterns across people, but then also coming up with new treatments, brain pacemakers, either based in things like microchips or ultimately with new proteins that the Brain Initiative has supported us in working to create to scale these treatments. So again, it's a super honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited about this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. So John, the Brain Initiative isn't just one giant project that's been going on for 10 years. It's actually made up of many hundreds, maybe thousands of research projects of the sort that Kath just described. If you're looking across that portfolio, what are some of the most promising advances that might offer hope for mental health treatments in the future that you're most excited about?
Right. So Brain Initiative, since it started funding grants in 2014, we've funded over 1,200, which is really, really exciting. And I look at the at this as a runway, and we're at different points of that runway. So we're laying some projects that I believe will give us long-term gains for the future. But we also are funding projects that are really exciting in that they're helping people now. So, right. So we need to make sure we can always have something on board that's going to give us some shorter term benefits. One of those is a technology that's been around for decades. It's called deep brain stimulation. Many of you might be familiar with deep brain stimulation, or DBS. It's been used for decades in treating the symptoms of movement disorders, like Parkinson's disease, by stimulating certain parts of the brain that control movement. Well, mental illnesses such as treatment-refractory depression, OCD, PTSD, we don't really quite know exactly where to place those electrodes. And moreover, we don't know exactly when we want to stimulate to bring a person from a bad mood state to a good mood state. But now we're actually seeing some case studies funded by Brain in a couple of different sites that have been able to map activity, brain activity, that correlates with when a patient is in a bad mood state or in a good mood state, very carefully map this both in distance and time, and actually to tune the stimulation of these DBS stimulation to move that person from a bad state to a good state. This is really quite exciting, right? I mean, this personalized medicine, this is leveraging all the tools we have in terms of understanding the circuits in the brain that might be involved, the patterns of activity, and actually using very sophisticated computational techniques to analyze these data on the fly. And it's showing great promise. We're right now just starting to move from case studies into longer term, larger studies. But I think this is a very promising future for us for the immediate term. We take this old technology, a lot of really cool tweaks that haven't been available to us before, to really address these issues in patients for whom it's literally life and death. I mean, these are patients that really have no other recourse. We talk to them and we say, this has been life-saving to me. I would have died without it. And it really gives us hope, can move that hope and motivation that we can move this as we are in the groundwork for longer term gains, which I can talk about. I'm sure, Kaf is in this space. He can really speak to these areas quite well.
That's really incredibly exciting. It sounds game-changing potentially in the future. Kaf, I was watching one of your videos where you were trying to get feedback from the audience, and you said, take your time, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm used to awkward silences, but you are a psychiatrist, a physician, as well as a scientist. Can you talk a little bit about how that clinical experience informs your work in the lab and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I talked a little bit in framing out the research we do, right? So we're trying to understand how all of this electrical activity in the brain, if we can come up with patterns of normal emotions and when emotions are more challenging, and then to come up with new treatments. And so for us, we want to ask fundamental questions about what are the emotional states and how, our brain interacts with the environment to allow individuals to do well. And so we've always historically in my lab we've asked questions about how things in the environment affect emotions, right? One thing in particular that we've always focused on is environmental stress. And when I used to give talks, particularly, 4 or 5 years ago, we walked people through explaining how stress can create all kinds of challenges with sleep and anxiety and difficulties eating. I think now, as a society, we become so intimately aware of that, given that the major stresses we've all gone through in the last 2 years. So we're trying to understand how is it that the brain navigates and processes stress, and why is it that some people who are stressed respond so well, while others have incredible challenges. And then the idea is if we can understand the process in which the brain is dealing with and processing stress, can we then use these tools that like those that are created through the Brain Initiative to essentially enhance resilience? And so now we're coming up with protective measures in the same way you could take a cholesterol medication to prevent the future heart disease. Can we use this technology to essentially turn up resilience such that as we're exposed and experiencing these challenges in society, whether it's a pandemic or other issues going on, we can help people continue to do well. So psychiatry is at the core of what we're doing, and we integrate that within neuroscience and engineering.
So moving towards preventative medicine and mental health in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
That's really exciting. Thank you. So, John, you mentioned the brain stimulation as one example, because we know that the time between basic discovery and clinical use can sometimes be long. But are there other examples stemming from the Brain Initiative that are currently in the clinical trials stage that you could talk about, particularly as it relates to mental health?
Right. I mean, these are the ones that are at the forefront right now. They're really, really exciting. I should say that 5 years ago, that the thought that we were doing today was literally science fiction. It's really come along very, very rapidly. There are other games as well, other applications of DBS for movement disorders. I mean, separate, but very, very important. We're looking for other shorter term gains. I mean, there's a lot of work being done in the pharmacology space. Now, if you think back, fluoxetine or Prozac was a game changer for psychiatry. The discovery of the use of Prozac for treating depression is 5 decades, years in the past. There hasn't really been a breakthrough since. But now with the tools that we're developing, researchers are able to better understand how molecules like serotonin, dopamine affect mood. We're getting really, really great sense for these what we call neurotransmitters, and also for the properties of these transmitters. So what drugs often do in these cases, they mimic these transmitters or they affect how they're processed. We've all heard a lot about the use of psychedelics in terms of treating severe depression. And to a large degree, it's very, very exciting, but there are side effects, right? Clearly, in terms of what we call dissociations. And now we're developing tools that actually are allowing researchers to identify drugs that have antidepressant activity without some of these unwanted side effects. So this might be kind of on a medium-term effect about what we can expect to gain if we can really kind of get the field moving on this and really get these assays and these processes through the pipeline, and to see if they really do work. So we're really quite excited about that in the next less than 10 years.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the opportunities in the future, right? So it wasn't too long ago, I was in medical school. I had hair back then. I wasn't as gray, but I spent a little bit of my time in a research space, actually at the National Institute of Mental Health, learning about this innovative new potential treatment, which was ketamine, right? This idea that you can give people treatments, people who were suffering in it, were some of the most perilous points in their life, a treatment that would help their symptoms improve, not necessarily in the 4 weeks that it took sometimes for things like Prozac or fluoxetine that John mentioned, but in the course of days. And it was remarkable for me as I was later in clinical training to be a psychiatrist, so several years later, to see that as an FDA-approved therapy, or even to see other therapies come to market, things like treatments to help with postpartum depression, or even the idea that you can stimulate the brain. John talked a little bit about deep brain stimulation, but you can actually stimulate the brain using magnetic fields outside of the head, using technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation to help with depression as well. And one of the things I think is so phenomenal about the Brain Initiative is the idea of supporting studies which allow us to figure out how to use those things better, perhaps in combination, perhaps stimulating the brain with different patterns. And the information we learn there has a really quick pathway to translation, particularly if we figure out how to use the tools we have better. So I am really hopeful about what's on the horizon and how the Brain Initiative has really supported that as well. I will say the other thing that makes me really excited about the Brain Initiative is I had the opportunity to be on the signing of the bill, the 21st Century Cures Act, a few years back when the current president was the vice president. And in addition to providing dramatic bipartisan support, $1.5 billion for the Brain Initiative, it also put a piece in place which tried to figure out how to support young scientists going into the field as well through the Next Generation Research Initiative. And I'm thinking in particular of 2 scientists that were recently supported through the Brain Initiative. One, Sophia Baez, who's at the National Institute of Mental Health, trying to understand how the brain processes working memory and cognition, things that can be altered in diseases like Alzheimer's. And the Brain Initiative is actually funding the scientists who will create the cures of tomorrow. The other one being Brielle Ferguson, who is also funded through the BRAIN Initiative, who works on, again, understanding motivation and cognitive processes. We'll be starting her lab quite soon at Harvard. And so in addition to thinking about the cures, I think it's so important that we also keep in mind that these cures come from scientists, and the BRAIN Initiative has played a fundamental role of bringing new scientists into the enterprise and supporting their ideas as well.
Well, while we're on the topic of,
that's great. That's
ahead, John.
yeah. Can I?
Oh, John, you're breaking up a little bit. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, you broke up. Yeah, can you? Okay, sorry. Yeah, are we good? Yeah. So just to add to what Kaf was saying, I mean, there's so many pieces to this that are so exciting. And one is Kaf touched on it. We have these new drugs on the horizon. They're showing great promise. Ketamine, the psychedelics, other methods like transcranial magnetic stimulation, other non-invasive methods. And what's really going to bring these things over the threshold is the mechanism. How are they actually working? You know, what are the processes they're affecting, and what is it about these processes that are making them potentially good cures? Because once we know the mechanism, once you know how it works, you can fine tune it. You can make it better. You can avoid some of the unwanted side effects. And these are the tools we're hoping to give the researchers out there. There's so much talent, as Kaf mentioned, especially the young talent. I mean, Kaf, you're not an old dog. I'm an old dog, right? But the new ideas that people have, they're not afraid of failure. They have these great ideas. They want to see them through. We talk a lot about funding level for biomedical science, and that's really important. But really, what's limiting is the ideas. And if people have great ideas, then the sky's the limit, right? And the ideas are out there. And right now, we just want to give these folks the resources. We're really, really proud of our young investigators that we're supporting. They're going out, starting their careers. They're going to be the future. They're going to bring the future closer to us faster.
That's really wonderful and very inspiring. And while we're on the topic of people, you know, at OSTP and in the Biden administration, we are explicitly focused not just on the science and technology itself, but making sure that the benefits of that science and technology are really available and accessible to all people, not just folks who have the means or who happen to live close to an academic medical center. And can you both talk a little bit about that and how you think about equity in the context of your work as scientists, or in the context of the BRAIN Initiative? You know, what can all of us as scientists do to ensure that, you know, what we're working on, even if it's basic research, a very fundamental question on the brain, ends up being accessible and equitably available to all of the people who can benefit from it? And Kaf, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last 3 years have really highlighted how essential all of us are to each other, right? And I think if we're going to continue to push towards human health and human improvement, we have to make sure that that applies to everybody. It's pretty clear that we as organisms or as individual people interact with environments. We live with different environments. We have sort of different genetic makeups. They're also really important for how we respond to different medications. And historically, it's not always been the case that we've made sure, as we're learning about medications, as we're learning about treatments, that they apply to everybody. I had an experience when I was in clinical training. We had a medication that we used to help people sleep. And a report came out when I was in residency that the right dosage for this medication was actually different for men than it was for women. And in some case, we might have actually been causing some degree of harm based on those dosages of difference. And as a basic science researcher, I quickly appreciated that in thinking about where medications come from, whether it's some of the early work we do in what we call model organisms like mice, or if we're using cells, that researchers weren't always thinking about doing experiments in male mice and female mice, or cells from men and cells from women. And that ultimately meant that we had treatments that weren't as good for everybody. So we've been thinking broadly as scientists, as part of the Brain Initiative, how to make sure that as we're coming up with understanding of the human brain, as we're coming up with new treatments, to make sure that that is maximally helpful for everybody. I think that's going to be critically important as we look at young people now and the rising incidence of anxiety and depression and the challenges that they're facing. If we don't create treatments that help everybody, we as a society are going to be in a much worse off place because as I get older, I'm sort of counting on those young people to ultimately take care of me. So I think it's an important consideration. We want to make sure that therefore our work is representative of society, both in the early basic research, in the clinical studies, but also in the communication of science more broadly, right? We need people that are representative of our society talking about the science, getting communities involved, and getting feedback as well. I got together with a group of scientists and community advocates a few years ago around an area we call the African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative, based out of Baltimore, really exploring this idea of how to get the community more involved in shaping the research questions, but also developing a pipeline of scientists outside of that community as well. So I think we have to be actively involved in developing these systems to deliver better science to our country.
Hear, hear. John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo a few things that Kyle said. We've had many discussions about this, and we're just trying to find ways to make things more equitable for all. One of our principles of the Brain Initiative is to ensure that the riches that we gain through our hard work are disseminated and democratized for the benefit of all. And we really hold this principle very near and dear to our heart. It really guides all that we do. We have a group of advisors who really ensure that these concepts about what we do, the ethical implications of what we do, the societal implications of what we do, we think about this from the very beginning. It's not something we just kind of, we'll get to this again, because by then it's way, way, way too late. Another aspect of this is who is doing the work. The folks doing the work are the ones deciding ultimately who is going to benefit. And in this regard, we've also taken a very intentional effort to ensure that we bring in diverse perspectives from people with different backgrounds, different scientific expertise, from different institutions across the country. There's a vast talent pool across the country, which I hate to say, we're not fully tapping into it. And the mental health crisis that the world is facing, we cannot afford to leave anybody on the sidelines. So this is one of our goals. It's a steep hill for us to climb, but I've committed ourselves, my colleagues and I have all committed ourselves to climbing that hill. Because in order to get the knowledge out there in a way that will benefit all, not just the privileged few, will take a very large village with people with different viewpoints, different perspectives, different expertise, and different ideas. Some of them are going to be completely out of the box. And those out-of-the-box ideas, guess what? They come from people who are thinking about things in a very, very different way. We're really excited. We think we can get a lot done this way. The onus is on us to do that. It's a responsibility, but I think it's one that it is one that we are taking very, very seriously.
That's great. And John, while you have the floor, maybe I'll also ask you that now that we are coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the Brain Initiative, you've announced some transformative projects on the horizon. Can you say a brief bit about what we can expect there?
Right. I mean, there was a review of the program at about the 5-year mark, and the group said, and Kafi, you were involved in that, that this is a great time, given all the great developments and discoveries, not just in neuroscience, but in genomics, genetics, engineering, physics. This is a time to invest big projects that could really transform the way we do science. And we mentioned in the very beginning of this webinar, the 200 billion or so cells between our ears that give rise to all of our emotions, thoughts. We need a better map of what they are. We need to know what the parts are, a parts list. We need to know how these cells communicate with each other, which requires a wiring diagram. If you want to understand how most complex computer that we know functions, both normally and abnormally, we need to know what are the parts, how do they communicate with each other. And then we also need ways to monitor the activity in there, both to test hypotheses, to understand basic processes, ultimately in order to modulate some of these circuits when they're not functioning right, things that Kof referred to before. So these are our 3 transformative projects. We're really, really excited. We're already seeing big, big wins from these projects. The Cell Atlas project that we've been supporting has already identified cells, specific types of neurons that are affected in specific neurodegenerative disorders. And what that gives us, it gives us a toehold in to understanding how they function normally, how are they malfunctioning, how we can fix them, and how they wire up to other parts of the brain that give rise to these different behaviors and phenotypes and what have you. So we're really, really excited. This is the long runway we're looking at, but I think we're going to look back in 10 years and say, wow, look how far we've come. And I think it will provide the basis for cures for diseases that 5 years ago, we had no hope of curing in our lifetimes or even our kids' lifetimes. I think we're going to see those before, we're out of the game.
That's super, super exciting. Kof?
Yeah, I just wanted to say hope is on the way, right, for all of those with family members and loved ones that are suffering. And I know there's sometimes young people out there who are streaming in or watching. And if you are suffering or in a difficult place right now, I always wanted to reinforce that there is help available. And the new number, I think, is 988. If you are in a difficult place, you can always reach out, and there's somebody who will be there to assist you. But again, with the Brain Initiative, I am encouraged because I think hope is on the way for the countless number of families that are suffering.
And just a quick finer point on that, Kof, if you could say a word, we've been trying with the Biden administration's Unity Agenda to fight the stigma of mental health and mental illness. Mental health is, of course, health, and mental health care is health care. Based on your experience as a scientist with the Brain Initiative, what do you see that helps make that case for people that they shouldn't hesitate to get help for mental illness any more than they should for any other kind of illness?
Yeah, I mean, I've given talks about stigma with communities and advocates for some time now. And the theme I like to say is science eradicates stigma, right? And so if you think about the history of medicine, there was a time when infectious diseases were stigmatized, whether it was HIV, AIDS, or you go back even further. And what we've seen over time is as scientists and clinicians and family members and advocates are coming together to really advocate for the next generation of treatments that help people, the stigma is decreased in dramatic ways. So I think it's really important for us to continue to build our communities, science, clinicians, advocates, family members, to come together to talk about and advance these changes with the hope that the treatments and the cures that are coming down the pipeline will continue to help ameliorate that stigma.
Great, thank you. Well, I could honestly sit here and talk to the two of you all day, but recognizing that you have important work to do, both of you, I think it's probably time to wrap up our conversation and say thank you so much, both for taking the time today, for all of the work that you're doing, and really looking forward to what's on the horizon. To our audience out there, I just want to note that we have further events in our series planned throughout the summer. And we also have the links up to our past events, including the ketamine story that was mentioned a couple of times, if you're interested in learning more. The next upcoming conversation is going to be a week from today on August 4th. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we're going to focus on the science behind alcohol misuse as a coping mechanism, which of course has been a hot topic throughout the course of the pandemic in particular. For those of you who have registered for today's event or any of our past events, we'll follow up with an email with more details on next week's virtual conversation. And you can keep an eye out on OSTP's events and webinars page, or at WHOSTP on Twitter for more information. Thank you again to our two panelists. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And with that, we're going to end today's session.
Thank you, Carrie.